Yeah, I was educated as a physicist and went to MIT undergraduate, Princeton for grad school, and what really got, can you hear me in the back? Am I loud enough all the way back in the back? Is that good? Okay. And what drew me into physics was really curiosity. I wanted to know how the universe worked. I felt intuitively there was a connection between things that are nearby and things that are far away. If you look out into the starry night, some summer night when the stars are clear, if you spin around, you feel this force when your arms are lifted up from your side. It's, of course, that's centrifugal force, but you'll also notice the stars appear to be spinning in your reference frame, and that was one of those little observations that made me wonder, is there some connection between things that are far away and things that are nearby? And when I was in freshman physics class, I had enough math to be dangerous, and I tried to do some calculations that suggested maybe there was a way that you could show that connection. I talked to my physics professor, and he said, "Oh, well, you've heard of Mach's principle, haven't you?" And of course I had not. But Ernst Mach, the man after whom the Mach number and high-speed jet flight is named, felt that there was some connection between the distant matter and things nearby, and that it might be possible to actually figure out what our physical forces are, electromagnetism, gravity, etc., if we understood that connection. So I liked that idea because it had that deep, far-reaching philosophy that actually has a chance to explain some things and maybe make things simpler. When I went through my education, I found that that's not incorporated into present-day physics. Einstein liked the idea too and thought he was going to be able to do it. His theory of gravity, called general relativity, he intended to include that idea, but when he got finished with the theory, Mach's principle fell away. So that was one of those ideas that has been in the back of my mind for a long time. I didn't have any encouragement by mainstream physics that it was anything more than just kind of a crazy hope. Until the mid-'80s, I began hearing rumors about something called remote viewing. And it was my first clue that maybe the universe does act this way. There is a way to connect things that are far away with things that are nearby. There's a force that's not in our present Western physics, the way it's written down, that actually does explain this connection. So that kind of got me looking at things like consciousness, like what we call paranormal phenomena, the things that Western physics pretty much ignores. But if we really understood how those things work, maybe we would be able to include these long-distance connections into our physics and have a new physics, an expanded physics, which includes the effect of consciousness. Of course, Bob Monroe was one of those pioneers who had the scientific mind, but also was not afraid to look at these strange phenomena. Some of his experiences, when he would go into outer body and he would see a hole in the wall and go into it and find another dimension, another world through that wall, suggested that maybe higher dimensions or parallel realities are something real. I mean, there was a quality of his experiences where they would often find the same world when he would go through that hole, not every time, but often enough to give you the idea maybe these parallel realities aren't just imagination, maybe there's some aspect of reality about them. So we'll talk today more about higher dimensions and parallel realities because those are things that you can actually understand from a physics point of view, and maybe we'll be able to better understand how to connect consciousness with science. Of course, when you go to higher focus levels, each focus level has its own quality, its own sense of a dimension, of certain rules and certain aspects that seem to be constant for that focus level, and also kind of reminds us of parallel dimensions and higher dimensions. A lot of research, as you know, has been done by many people, Scott Rogo, Keith Harari, Hubbard, and Puthoff, that suggest that the out-of-body experience does have a quality of reality about it, that you can actually measure physical effects that tell us that it's more than just our imagination. We're not just in our mind, but that our mind actually goes somewhere in some cases. So our analysis of these effects has led us to a similar conclusion, that these parallel realities may actually have some actual existence. As you know, in Western physics, consciousness very early in the 20th century was important. In the days when quantum mechanics was first being researched, there were these terrific debates between Einstein and Bohr, Niels Bohr, about quantum physics, because they noticed that if an observer makes a measurement, something called a wave function collapse occurs. If you leave the experiment alone, quantum physics works its own magic, and the equations describe what they call a wave function, which tells you how things are supposed to unfold and behave. But if you make a measurement, it messes up that wave function. It actually kind of forgets what it's doing. It collapses into a quantum state, and you start all over again in a way. So you create noise when you make a measurement, and you lose some of the continuity that was present before. So consciousness affects quantum physics, and they understood that very early. This is what bothered Einstein a great deal. He made the comment that God doesn't play dice with the universe, because it leads to an uncertainty that Einstein felt intuitively, there's something missing here from this picture. But at least they were both looking at consciousness. They were facing that it was important. Now, if you were a physicist and you're listening to this debate 100 years ago, you'd say, man, consciousness is really important if I want to ever understand quantum physics, which is the foundation of Western physics. So you'd think for the last 100 years, Western physics would put a lot of emphasis into studying consciousness. How does it fit with Western physics? How does it behave? But instead, by and large, after you take your quantum physics course in college, and they tell you this story about the interaction and the wave function collapse, that's the last you hear about it. And you can't publish, by and large, studies on consciousness in mainstream physics journals. They pretty much go along as if consciousness is not important. So mainstream Western physics does not know a lot about consciousness beyond this elementary fact of wave function collapse. So we're coming up to a time now where we have a lot of experiments that have been done by other groups that are showing that consciousness can be very powerful. And so it's time to go back and revisit this and find a way to put the two together. But Western physicists are not probably the ones who are going to do it, because they haven't been worrying about this problem for most of the time. One example of the effect of consciousness, which Einstein raised, which he kind of felt would be the coup de grace to this whole idea of wave function collapse, because he thought that it was so ridiculous, was the Schrödinger cat paradox. And the thought experiment is that you have a cat in a box that you can't look into. It's sealed. Inside there's a Geiger counter, and there's a radioactive process, something that's emitting alpha particles, let's say, at a random quantum physical way. If the detector detects an alpha particle, it drops poison into the water, and it fills the room, the little box, with a gas that kills the cat. But if the whole thing is sealed, the observer doesn't know whether this has happened or not. So from a quantum physics point of view, according to the strict interpretation of quantum mechanics, there's an amplitude that it hasn't happened and an amplitude that it has happened. So inside the box, you'd have to picture a dead cat and a live cat, and both have some probability of being there, and therefore in the quantum physics point of view, their wave functions are both completely present there. And it's only when you open the box up or lift the flap that you find out, and the wave function collapses into one or the other. Now Einstein felt this is a ridiculous situation, and therefore tells us that there's something wrong with quantum mechanics. However, this is the current accepted view, and physicists just kind of learn to believe this and not be bothered by it. But it's an example of how powerful consciousness is in physical processes. I think we're at a time now where it's probably necessary to go back and look at these things again in terms of how can we fit consciousness into physics in a more consistent way. There are some things that are going on that are being measured and observed which are challenging to Western physics and actually break the laws of Western physics. And if you're a physicist, that's exciting because that means there's a chance to do something new. Of course, the reaction of most Western physicists has been to just ignore these experiments and not be bothered by them. That's another way to resolve the issue. Just close your eyes. When the remote viewing program, the military program, became public, as you know, many of the participants formed schools and made it possible for average folks like me to take remote viewing courses. I took several courses from Courtney Brown, who was trained by Ed Dames. And so in the mid-90s, I took several courses. And even though I'm not a very good remote viewer, I had enough success and enough experiences to realize that, hey, this works. And of course, part of the method, and I'm telling some of you who know a lot more about this than I do, so please forgive me, but the methodology, as I understand it, is that there's a protocol that keeps your left brain, your analytical brain, busy categorizing things, filling in tables, and my left brain, it's very hard to shut up. It's very hard to keep it out of the problem. So this system worked well for me, and after a little while going through the protocol, I found myself in one particular example with a Spanish-style house with a tile roof, and I came up with Exodus and the Red Sea and a flurry of activity. And the drawing here, I've added color to it since the session, but that's what I was drawing. I was drawing Roman soldiers building a barricade, and in the distance there was something bright and dangerous with smoke and fire. And eventually I came up with destruction of Pompeii, which was the correct target. What I noticed in remote viewing is that regardless of whether you're right or wrong or even know where you are, there's a sense of being there. There's a sense of presence. You may not be able to figure out what it is, but there's still a sense of that part of you is there. And that's remarkable given that many times the events happened a long time ago. Pompeii, a couple thousand years. One of our targets was the destruction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. And yet in the session, you're still right there. So that tells you that whatever this force is that's communicating between you and the target, that's not electromagnetism. That's not gravity. That's not any of the forces that's in our Western physics today. There's something else there. Jessica Utz was one of the people involved in evaluating that program when it ended, and she said, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it's concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. Of course, the Princeton Pear Lab was one of a number of labs that went about doing systematic studies after this information, and in sort of parallel to it, they found, using not the highly talented remote viewers in the military program, but just more or less average students and volunteers, but they still found with many, many experiments that they could come up with results, and they found that the accuracy for remote viewing does not weaken with distance, and you can have a time offset between the target and when you're doing your session. The time offset doesn't seem to affect accuracy either plus or minus, future or past. And this is true of other psychic processes as well, psychokinesis, ESP, etc., which means that these processes are totally unlike any of the forces that we know about in Western physics. This is a typical example from the Princeton Pear Lab. If you have one person or lots and lots of people, and they're more or less average, so they're not very good. They make a lot of mistakes, like I would, and so the answers look like a Gaussian curve, centered around the peak at 50%. You're half right and half wrong, except that the Princeton Pear Lab found a hump on the upper side. They still get more right than wrong, even for more or less average people. And when you have enough experiments, you calculate the odds of that hump being there, and at one point, after about 20 years of work, the odds were 55 billion to 1 for that hump being the size it was. In other words, overwhelming that it's real. ESP is real, psychic processes are real. At the present time, when they put together all their data, they're seeing like trillions to 1 odds against chance. So these are firmly established processes today, even though you won't hear the media talking that way, but these are real effects. Robert John, who ran that program, used to be head of the engineering department when I was there, concluded all forces known to physics, like gravity, for example, diminish with distance, and no force in physics operates freely across time like this. It's as if consciousness is somehow able to direct its influence directly across space and time, an understanding that certainly poses a challenge for science. And as you know, other people like Edgar Mitchell did a little surprise ESP experiment on his way back from the moon. He has the record, as far as I know, with long-distance ESP, successfully sending messages to people a couple 100,000 miles away. Measurements have been made of average people using, just looking at the brain waves. For most of us, we're not very disciplined. We don't meditate. If we're not under hypnosis, our brain is just very noisy. It's always chattering. We don't listen very well to what it's telling us. So for people like that, like me, and like a lot of people, you can still look at the brain waves. And this is an experiment done by Lloyd in the mid-70s, looking at the brainwave changes when an ESP message is received. And the top trace shows how the brainwave changes when you hear a musical note. The bottom trace shows how the brainwaves change when you receive an ESP message. Now these people, by and large, were asked after the experiment, did you receive an ESP message? And they said no. But their brain showed that they had received it, which tells us that virtually everyone has the basic receiving machinery to be able to receive psychic messages. Most of us haven't learned to quiet our minds to be able to listen. And of course, that's one of the great benefits of HemiSync and the technology here at Monroe, to learn to quiet your mind. But ESP is widespread. And the Baxter effect is one other example. I want to go very briefly through some of these because, I mean, for me, as a scientist, I want to understand how this stuff works as best I can. It may be that we'll be able to find better ways of achieving some of these states from understanding the science of it, but mostly it's all I know. This is what I'm interested in, is what consciousness can tell us about higher dimensions and about the deeper nature of reality. Cleve Baxter discovered that plants respond psychically to emotions and to feelings. He was working in his office late one night. He ran a successful polygraph training facility in New York at the time. He thought his house plant needed some water. Since it was late at night, he did one of those strange things people do when they're tired. He said, I wonder what would happen if I hooked up my plant to my polygraph machine. And he kind of figured, well, the conductivity will increase when I add water to it, so I would expect the trace would go down. But actually he found the trace went through waves and looked very much like a patient or a client having an emotional response to receiving water. That got his curiosity up. Polygraph operators are trained to put their client under stress. That's just their second nature. So the next thought that popped into his mind was, I wonder what would happen if I burned its leaf. Well, to his surprise, without doing anything and without saying anything, the trace went crazy on the polygraph right away. So the plant picked up his thought, and that got his attention. And that started along many years programs of doing research on the ability of plants to receive messages from people. Baxter kept a lot of plants wired up in his home after that, and here is a trace showing what happens when he broke an egg to put in his dog's food dish. When he broke the egg, basically he killed the fertilized cell in the egg. The plant responded with a big pulse right there on the trace. The plant was empathetic to the destruction of the egg. Baxter also found that if you pour living brine shrimp into boiling water, plants respond. Anyway, there's a lot more to it, as you probably know. It's fascinating research, but it shows even plants have this ability. As there's a program here, or has been certainly in the past, the PK, being able to affect the rolling of dice. The Princeton Pear Lab, among others, did a lot of work with how people can affect things at a distance with their minds. They used to have a vertical pinball machine. You drop a steel ball at the top, it hits nails and makes a path down to the bottom, and it kind of piles up in a Gaussian-shaped curve at the bottom randomly. Then they would ask someone to sit across the room and try to make the Gaussian curve move to the right. So the balls tend to fall to the right or to the left. And they found people could do that. But that machine was pretty cumbersome, so eventually they came up with what's called a random event generator, which is a little noise maker, electronic quantum noise maker that makes random ones and zeros. But it's equivalent. It's just like flipping a coin, but it's faster. And I used to have a friend who was part of this program, and they would ask her, she lived in Texas, they would say, okay, on Thursday from 10 until 11, we want you to try to make the generator go high. And so she would do that, and over time, sure enough, it tended to go in the direction that she wanted it to, and even though there was a couple thousand miles between her home and the Princeton lab where the generator was sitting. This is some data over time added together here. You can see that the red curve at the top shows what happens to the counts when people try to make it go high. The counts keep adding up, +1, +1, +1, and it goes higher and higher. If they're trying to go low to make a 0, then that makes the count lower and lower and lower. If you don't do anything, you get the line in the middle. So this is what happens with PK, and it shows that our minds are able to affect quantum noise, even over very large distances. And as I said before, the cumulative odds against chance for some of this data is now trillions to 1, which means these are real effects. Group consciousness occurs when many people begin thinking about the same thing at the same time. You might imagine that that would make a stronger effect. This was verified originally in some, I think there was an Academy Award experiment. It was one of them, and people were watching the Academy Awards, millions of people watching the same TV show. This data here is from the O.J. Simpson trial, when a lot of people were also tuning in to see what the verdict was. And they took 2 random event generators, both based on quantum noise. These should be totally independent of each other. One gives you a 1, the other should give an equal probability of a 0 or a 1. There should be no relationship. They were several miles apart. But they found that when many, many people focus on the same thought, these random event generators no longer act independent of each other. Now, when one gives a 1, the other tends to give a 1. One gives a 0, other one gives a 0, which means quantum noise over great distances becomes correlated in a way that totally flies in the face of Western physics. So when the TV pre-show begins, you get the first peak on the left. When the verdict was announced, you get the right peak. And it means these two objects are behaving very similarly, like a couple together, when many people are watching the same thing. When 9/11 occurred, at that time there was a network worldwide of several dozen of these devices in many places around the world. All of a sudden you had a huge mass consciousness event when millions of people, or maybe even billions, were focusing on their TVs or listening on the radio and thinking about this event. And this global network of little REGs run by the Global Consciousness Project, Roger Nelson and Dean Radin, found that their little random event generators around the world began acting like they were coupled together. And you get these curves starting to rise far beyond whatever would be expected by chance. Here's a peak at the time the airplanes hit the building, or shortly after that, about 60,000 to 1 odds against chance that that kind of correlation would occur. The same type of thing happens when there's other types of global synchronized events. This is for synchronized prayer, synchronized meditation. These networks also show correlations. They're showing that our consciousness is affecting space-time, it's affecting the laws of physics around the world. And it tells us that if we want to change the world, if we want to bring more peace to the world, maybe synchronized prayer is a way to do that, that we actually have power, more power than we realize, and we can measure the power of prayer by looking at how these numbers are affected when we pray together or meditate together. So these are more experiments showing our minds really are connected. The question is, how can we explain this in terms of Western science? We could think about the effect of consciousness. Another way that I'll talk about in a few minutes is called subtle energy, qi, which is a Chinese name for it, or the life force. You could think there's a force that actually arises when there are big consciousness events occurring, and a physicist might talk in a more less emotional way called them non-standard vacuum states, but they're kind of all equivalent to each other. The vacuum is sort of like the basis of Western physics. It's where you start in trying to understand Western physics. It's the vacuum of outer space, but it's also the vacuum between atoms. It's the vacuum right in this room. It's sort of the nature of space when there's no particles there. And it's sort of like the beginning point of Western science. What the Russians found is that there's not just one vacuum state, that you can actually change it. It's not really empty, and you can change the energy in the state and therefore change how the vacuum behaves. And they took a DNA, shined a laser on it in a vacuum, and they found that it changed the vacuum. It created some kind of strange particle that had no mass that could hang around for hours or sometimes even days when there was no matter in the vacuum chamber. This appears to be the first time that prana, or the life force, or qi, has been created in a scientific laboratory, and they did studies on it. But we have a lot more data to show that strange things happen, as I'm sure anyone who comes here frequently knows, and the out-of-body experience, of course, is one of them. That's also a challenge to Western physics. How do you explain this? These are states where there's probably no matter present, and yet there's intelligence. Things happen. A classic out-of-body experiment was done in the early 40s. It's called the Landau OBE case that was published in a journal. Mr. Landau's wife tended to go out of body when she was sleeping at night. and had all kinds of experiences. So they wanted to do a controlled test. So he said, okay, when you go out of body at night, I want you to take my address book, which you put beside your bed, and bring it in and leave it on my floor by me to show you've been there. And they were planning, I think, to leave the door closed just to make it even more exciting. But when she tried to pick up his address book, when she went out of body that night, her hand went through it. She couldn't pick it up because she'd been taught all her life, don't pick up things that aren't yours. As the best she could do, she looked around her room and found a little stuffed toy dog and picked that up and took that into her husband's bedroom. And so this little sketch is showing his perspective in his bed, looking out. She's just deposited the stuffed dog beside his bed, and she was kind of floating and gliding backwards, her astral body, her out-of-body form, semi-transparent and white-colored, backing out of the room, backing into her room. He could see her physical body still sleeping in her bed across the hall. So this was a typical example of an OBE case. Now, there are a lot of things in this example, as you might imagine, that Western physics doesn't have a clue how to explain, okay? First of all, I mean, Western physics doesn't know how you can have an intelligent form of matter or matter without mass or force without mass, or, you know, trying to describe the contradictions in terms of, for a Western physicist, you know, it's a big list of things that don't fit our Western science. This is another experiment Bob Monroe talked about, where he was in an isolated chamber that had wires in the walls, part of the electromagnetic shielding, but he hooked up a high voltage to the wire grid in the chamber and then tried to go out of body. And he found that although he normally was able to go out of through the walls, through the wires very easily, when high voltage was applied, he could not. The wires ensnared him. So there's a relationship between high voltage and the out-of-body state or the astral body, which suggests that there are experiments one can do, and there's some physics here. We may be able to learn more about how these things interact. Hubbard and Hal Puthoff and a couple other physicists learned that the Chinese were doing really interesting experiments with out-of-body. They had some remote viewers who were asked to try to look at a sealed envelope which had a Chinese character in the envelope and tell them what Chinese character was there. But the Chinese also had a piece of film in the envelope as well. So, and they found that when the viewer was successful at telling them the correct character, the film actually became exposed and was imprinted with the Chinese character. So there's some kind of energy that was present during the out-of-body experience, and the astral body, or whatever you want to call it, that was present at the location of the character caused the film to become exposed. So Puthoff and Hubbard tried to reproduce that in America using a photomultiplier tube, which is very sensitive, able to measure small amounts of light. And again, they found that their remote viewer, when he reported correctly on the nature of a picture or an image, that near that image there was a flash of light or presence of light that was anomalous. There was, again, a correlation, which says that our astral body, if you want to call it that, our center of consciousness that leaves the physical body, has some energy to it, has some ability to show up in our conventional physical measuring system. So there's something that's physical there, something that's, at least it's measurable, thank goodness, right? Another famous experiment by Carlos Osis, Alex Tannhaus was the remote viewer, the psychic involved in this experiment. He was strapped down to a chair in one lab, and then at the far end of the corridor in another lab was a sealed room with a chamber and a scene that mechanically was altered in a regular way, and they asked Tannhaus to describe what the image looked like. So we had to go out of body and go into the other room and be in a certain position to be able to see the scene and give the correct description. They found that when he did, the sensors that were set up around the chamber went crazy. They got very big readings. They had strain gauges, they had optical sensors, magnetic sensors, and so again it shows, there's a little picture of Tannhaus's astral body there, but something was present in the vicinity of the picture, so that when we see something, when we remote view something, in some cases there's some energetic form that's actually present where that occurs. Another type of experiment done by Keith Harari. He had a cat that was very fond of him, and vice versa, I guess. And they took the cat off into put him in a box out in the middle of a field. Harari was in a lab room some distance away, and tried to go out of body. And the cat was off, surrounded by a couple of strange experimenters in this little box. The floor of the box was ruled with squares, and they kept track of how many squares the kitten crossed and how many times he meowed per minute while the experiment was going on. And the bottom graph is, let's see, the number of meows. And the left-hand bar, the big bar that you can see, is the number of meows that the kitten made when, in the normal conditions. When Harari went out of body and tried to go to the kitten to comfort it, the right-hand bar, which you can just barely see, just almost zero, occurred. The kitten got very quiet when Harari was out of body trying to comfort the kitten. So the kitten knew that he was present. Other forms that are also a challenge to Western physics that are all related to this, orbs. Of course, there are plenty of examples of false orbs. It's easy to get orbs from your flash illuminating little raindrops or dust particles or insects, lens flares, things like that. But there are also pictures that appear to be genuine orbs. This is one that a friend of mine took. We were doing an experiment trying to photograph orbs, and after several days, the adults came up with zip, and a 12-year-old was walking back to the cabin and saw this 3-foot diameter orb hovering in front of the cabin and said, "I thought it wanted me to take its picture." So she did, and then it was zipped away. And this is another one, a friend of mine, we were doing some ghost hunting, and this strange-looking vortex showed up in the picture, which is probably, again, an orb. So there's some that show up that seem pretty likely to be genuine. This is one that showed up in the basement of a ghost hunter's house. He kind of grew up in this house that was very haunted, and we were revisiting his boyhood bedroom, basically, the lower floor of the house. All the lights were off. We had a Sony night shot camera going, and he was seeing many orbs in his viewfinder, and he was telling me about all of the orbs he was seeing. Well, either he had a better camera or he's just a lot faster, which is more likely, and I wasn't seeing anything. I'm standing in the dark with my camera and I'm not seeing anything, and I started to complain a little bit. I said, "Could you make him slow down? Could you ask one to appear for me?" So he speaks into the darkness and says, "Would an orb please show up for Claude's camera?" And within a couple of seconds, this one little dot, which is circled in this picture on the top frame, popped in, and over the next couple of seconds, very leisurely, it moved toward me and to the right. I got about 20 frames on my camera of this thing. So I'm convinced that it was a conscious response, and it was very easy to see that one. It was unmistakable. So, and of course, orbs are also often seen at time of death. I used to know a lady who worked at a hospital. She was a nurse and had been present with